Tone Talk. How's everybody doing today? This is Antonio Moore coming back to you from Tone Talks. I wanted to come back and do a follow-up video to the video I did yesterday on Charleston, Virginia, and the protests that happened there and the violence that followed. I want to say thank you to all of the subscribers and the new watchers that pushed this last video to 150,000 views. Let's keep the support going, keep sharing these videos, get the dialogue going so we can move America forward. We had almost 4,000 comments in this last video and it's still growing. One of the things that I wanted to do in this video was first to share that thanks, but then also to deal with some of the common myths and themes that I'm seeing in the comments of the last video once in one stop, and kind of just lay out the realities of what American slavery was and what actually happened versus the myths that I'm seeing being perpetuated through the statements and throughout the actual comment thread. What I want to start off dealing with is this idea that slavery was not the economic engine of America, of early America particularly, but that grounded America and created its economic advantage when compared to the rest of the globe at that time. Between about the years of its early start prior to the Revolutionary War all the way well into the mid-1900s. And I think for a lot of us, what we've created is a dynamic that there were all these different things that kind of created the advantage. When having free labor, free human labor was the advantage. Particularly free labor that you created a dynamic of being 3/5 of a human so they could ask for and demand no rights. And I think, you know, the best thing that I found is just to go to an institute called the Gilder Lehrman American Institute. I'm pulling that up now and share a little section with you. One crop, slave-grown cotton, provided over half of all U.S. export earnings. By 1940, the South grew 60% of the world's cotton and provided some 70% of the cotton consumed by the British textile industry. Slavery paid for a substantial share of the capital, iron, and manufactured good that laid the basis for American economic growth. So it's important to understand this, because if you don't understand this, you don't understand America, white or black. And I don't think that they teach enough of this for people to really understand what slavery was. It was the gasoline that jet fueled America into the stratosphere it was globally. And I think for a lot of people, what they tend to do is recreate the narrative like slavery was just in the South and just this niche industry, and it wasn't. It was America. And the failure of not understanding that has led to a whole dynamic where we don't understand what to celebrate, why to celebrate it, and what not to celebrate. And I feel like that's what's going on with the General Lee statue, him being from the Confederate Army, and essentially trying to celebrate the institution without doing anything in regard to apology, anything in regard to reparations, when actually the people who come from these families should be wealthy in this country and literally are poor. At one point in this video towards the end, I'm going to share an animated video that explains black and white wealth, so we don't have to guess. Because a lot of people in the thread in the prior video seem to not understand that slavery has riveted a cost in black American families that has lasted into today, and has also given an advantage to white American families that has lasted well into today. By one standard, I was listening to Thomas Shapiro of Black Wealth, White Wealth speak, and he said, in rough estimates, somewhere between a quarter of white homes can be traced all the way back to land grants. An advantage that black people were not given access to. An advantage that comes out of race. And I think for a lot of us, what we don't understand, and this is according to Yale historian David W. Blight, in 1860, slaves as an asset were worth more than all of America's manufacturing, all of the railroads, all of the productive capacity of the United States put together. Slaves were the single largest, by far, financial asset of property in the entire American economy. This is what we're dealing with right now. We're dealing with not only the reality that slavery happened, but a whole group society that doesn't understand what slavery was and the role that it played in creating and founding and grounding America. What I want to do is go through 6 different points, and I just went through one. I want to go through 6 different points to kind of explain the myths that I see in the comment section of the prior video about Charlottesville, Virginia, and I want to kind of go through those and lay out the reality of what is the truth versus what's not the truth. And those 6 areas are: number 1, slavery wasn't the economic engine of America. We just addressed that. Number 2, white Irish were slaves. Number 3, the Union seceded over state rights. Number 4, small percentages of Southerners were slave owners. Number 5, Africans sold slaves into slavery and blacks owned slaves in America. And number 6 is slavery ended 100 years ago. Why should I pay for that if I came after the Emancipation Proclamation? Why should I have to pay? And so, like, you know, what I'm going to move to is the second one, because we just dealt with number 1, which is slavery wasn't the engine that drove the American economy. I just laid out the reality that it was. It just simply was. This is not a question about whether you have a different opinion. You can live in fact about what America really was and how America was created, or you can live somewhere else where you try to create a new narrative. Now, number 2 is white Irish were slaves. I pulled up a history.com article. History.com is, I believe, the History Channel, and I think that they have 3 myths that will help me with 3 of these points answered, and I'm going to pull them up one by one and share it with you and then give my opinion. And then, you know, you can always comment in the section and you know, fight the fight if you want to. But this is legitimate websites and institutes that I'm using. So, the myth is there were Irish slaves in the American colonies. As historian and public librarian Liam Hogan has written, there is unanimous agreement based on overwhelming evidence that the Irish were never subjugated to perpetual hereditary slavery in the colonies based on a notion of race. The enduring myth of Irish slavery, which most often surfaces in service of Irish nationalists and white supremacist causes, has roots in the 17th and 18th century when Irish laborers were derogatorily called white slaves. The phrase would later be employed as propaganda by the slave-owning South about the industrialized North, along with false claims that life was far harder for immigrant factory workers than for slaves. What's the truth? Truth is, large numbers of indentured servants did indeed immigrate from Ireland to the British colonies of North America, where they provided a cheap labor force for planters and merchants eager to exploit it, though most crossed the Atlantic willingly. Some Irish men and women, including criminals as well as simply poor and vulnerable, were sentenced to indentured servitude in Ireland and forcibly shipped to the colonies to carry out their sentence. But indentured servitude, by definition, came nowhere near to chattel slavery. For one thing, it was temporary. All but the most serious felons were freed at the end of their contracts. The colonial system also offered more lenient punishments for disobedient servants than slaves, and allowed servants to petition for early release if their master mistreated them. Most importantly, servitude was not hereditary. Children of indentured servants were born free. Slaves' children were the properties of their owners. This is the reality of everything. You can sit up and make up whole new narratives where there was white slaves in America. But black Americans were 3/5 of a human. Black Americans' children were born into slavery. I think for a lot of people, they have never learned American history appropriately or factually. And so what they're doing is they're recreating these narratives, and all the facts are there, but they don't want to hear the facts. So that debunks the whole idea that white Irish were slaves. They just weren't. They were indentured servants, and then they were allowed to be free, and their children were born free. Number 3, seceded over states' rights. What a lot of people like to think is that the South seceded from the Union over the issues of state rights, not slavery. You know, that this was not about like the institution of keeping people in bondage, when it was. You know, this is what they say on the history.com website, pulling it up for you. This myth that the Civil War wasn't fundamentally a conflict over slavery would have been a surprise to the original founders of the Confederacy. In the official declaration of the causes of their secession in December 1860, South Carolina's delegates cited an increasing hostility on the part of non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery. According to them, the Northern interference with the return of fugitive slaves was violating their constitutional obligations. They also complained that some states in New England tolerated abolitionist societies and allowed black men to vote. This war was about slavery, no matter if you want it to be or not. And I think that for a lot of us, we don't want to look back at the Civil War and see what it was, and we don't understand why those monuments got to come down like Lee's monument. There's a reason that when they changed the name of that Lee Park in Charlottesville, Virginia, they named it Emancipation Park. Because at the end of the day, the turnkey of this is the emancipation of African Americans. The freedom of African Americans in a country that is built on nothing but freedom, supposedly. And so this debunks this whole idea that I'm seeing in the comment section that slavery was not at the core of the Civil War. It was. The next one is this myth that only a small percentage of Southerners own slaves. So I'm hearing this myth that 2% of Southerners or 2% of Americans own slaves, so it wasn't that bad. That's what's in the comments. I want to kind of address that. I want to make it clear. So I'm going to start off reading another section from history.com. And you can pull this article up yourself when this is all done just to check it out. But it's just what facts are. Closely related to myth 2, the idea that the vast majority of Confederate soldiers were men of modest means rather than large plantation owners is usually used to reinforce the contention that the South wouldn't have gone to war to protect slavery. The 1860 census shows that in states that would soon secede from the Union, an average of more than 32% of white families owned slaves. Some states had far more slave owners, 46% in South Carolina, 50% in Mississippi, while some had far less, 20% in Arkansas. Continuing on, but Jamil Bowie and Rebecca Onion point out on Slate.com the percentages don't fully express the extent to which the antebellum South was a slave society built on a foundation of slavery. Many of those white families who couldn't afford slaves aspired to as a symbol of wealth and prosperity. In addition, the essential ideology of white supremacy that served as a rationale for slavery made it extremely difficult and terrifying for white Southerners to imagine life alongside a black majority population that was not in bondage. So what we're seeing is an attempt to relegate slavery to a niche of people when it was an institution that undergirded a nation. When it was an institution that was a core foundational pillar, particularly for a region, and that region being the South. When it was the core reason for the South going to war. And I think that to keep that intact, the advantage of having slaves. Imagine having a whole nother person that could just do all the things that you got to do tomorrow for you. And all of a sudden they tell you that you can't have that person no more. But you've had that person, and your fathers had that person, and your grandfathers had that person. So you don't know how to do nothing else but use that person. Think about it. And then think about the idea that you have to compete against a group of people all of a sudden that have never been paid. How hard would somebody work that's worked in the field their whole life without ever being paid? That's got to strike fear in your heart. You ain't never done a day of work picking cotton. The next one is this idea that Africans sold slaves into slavery, so as a result, white people can absolve themselves because they were not the people that created this, and that's what I'm getting in the comments. I believe that, we got to get honest and be clear that that's part of the story, but it is not the whole story. There was an article done on Huffington Post that kind of laid this out and gave us a brief synopsis. You can pull it up yourself, pulling it up now. That article is called "Did We Sell Each Other into Slavery? Misconceptions about the African Involvement in the Slave Trade." In the first place, the Portuguese initiated what eventually became the transatlantic slave trade, mainly through slave raids across the coast of Africa. The first of these raids came in 1444 and was led by Lencront de Freitas. The problem with raiding for slaves was that it was extremely dangerous. For instance, the slave trader Nuna Triasto was killed during an ambush. Slave raiding proved to be an extremely dangerous way to obtain slaves, but buying slaves was much safer and took less effort on the part of the Europeans. Therefore, the first phase of slave trade began not with a trade, but with a series of raids. This point is especially important because although the slave trade was on some levels based on partnership between European buyers and African traders, the slave trade as a whole did not begin as such. He continues by saying, moreover, the partnership between traders and buyers was an uneasy one. The European slave traders often betrayed those who supplied them with slaves. A famous case of this was African slave trader Daga, who was tricked and captured by slave traders. So, in essence, what I feel is just as important as the overall reality that's not totally a myth. It doesn't tell the story, nor does it absolve America of the reality of how they used slaves for multiple generations. This was not a singular lifetime event. This was multiple generations over 300 years. And I think for a lot of people who are commenting about how slavery, it was something that we don't have to be responsible for, how did it affect me, it was a long time ago. None of those people understand race or where we're at today. They don't understand that we're in a country where 90 out of $94 trillion of household wealth, white America has 90% of that as a direct result of slavery and the institution that followed, which is Jim Crow. Black America has 2.6% of the national wealth. 2.6%. They don't understand that due to land grants, due to unfair redlining, that white America controls 98% of the rural land. 98%. Black America controls 1%. Only 3% of America is urban. 3%. That's according to a new article that just came out last week. So white America basically almost owns everything as a direct result of slavery and Jim Crow, and now doesn't want to deal with the fact that slavery and Jim Crow happened. You got a deal. You can't have a win and then want to hold your hands up when we try to explain why you got the win, especially when it's built on the backs and the bones of my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, my great-great-great-grandfather, and people like me. And so, one of the other things that I heard in the comments was that a large number of blacks were slave owners. I think that we don't understand how complex this institution was, how all-encompassing this institution was, and most importantly, what is getting lost is that the bulk of those people were buying back their own wife and kids. Don't get me wrong, there was aberrations, few individual like black slave owners that did it for profit, but the large bulk of black people that bought slaves were buying back their own family. And I think for a lot of real people, real people that are studying like the past, they're trying to angle it and look at it in a certain light, and it's just all wrong. It's like slavery was an institution created by white America, continued by white America, and maintained by white America. And black America was along for the ride. And I no matter how you twist it to make you feel a little better, that's just the truth. The last point that I wanted to share was this idea, this mythological idea that slavery ended 100 years ago. And it's, why should it matter? Why should I have to pay if I'm Serbian and I just got here? I got here in 1975. Look. Slavery didn't end 100 years ago. What happened was they said the Emancipation Proclamation let the slaves be free, but they didn't add any teeth to the actual document, to the actual statement. There wasn't investigations into whether slaves were let free until well into the 40s. I'm going to pull up circular number 3591 under Roosevelt, written by Francis Biddle, his Attorney General. This is the first time that they started to investigate whether people had freed their slaves. 50 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Slaves were kept throughout the South, through the teens and the 30s. And so, like, you had this whole thing called slavery by another name, as given by Douglas Blackman. Watch the PBS documentary and learn something. And what it showed is that through peonage, everybody from U.S. Steel during the Industrial Revolution built their wealth on the backs of black bodies and treated them worse than slaves in a new form of slavery by another name. And I really feel like when you look at this circular number 3591, it was a directive by Attorney General Francis Biddle to all United States attorneys concerning the procedure for handling cases relating to involuntary servitude, slavery, and peonage, following the formal abolition of slavery in the United States at the end of the Civil War. Freed slaves in the American South often found themselves subject to conditions of forced labor that approximated to slavery. Peonage in the age of neo-slavery. It wasn't 100 years ago. And I think for a lot of us, that's hard to accept. It's hard to accept that what whiteness means in this country, or what blackness means in this country. But it means. For a lot of people, the whole narrative comes, well, I came after slavery. If you go to a city of Los Angeles, and a police officer gets in any kind of altercation, as a result, the city has to pay a fine of several $million to an individual. You don't get to opt out and say, I wasn't here when they did that incident. I don't want to pay taxes on that. You can leave the city, or you can pay the taxes. America did this. And because America did this, it owes a debt and an apology to the descendants of American slavery. I just wanted to lay out those 6 points and kind of just debunk the things that I'm seeing in the comment section just in one swoop. You know, I appreciate everybody tuning in. I'm going to show you a viral video that I did, an animated video on wealth, about race and wealth in America, so you can get some of the data for yourself. Share that with your kids, share that with your family, with your neighborhood. Please subscribe and donate to tonetalks.org. Thank you so much for tuning in, and please keep sharing both of these videos. You know, we're at 150,000. Hopefully we can reach 500,000. Thank you. Tone Talks brings to you the racial wealth gap in America, explained in 60 seconds. In America, there are 190 million whites, living in just about 82 million homes, while there are 40 million blacks, living in just over 14 million homes. To truly understand the racial wealth gap, you must look past the income of these families and evaluate household worth. According to demos.org, in total, white American households own 90% of the national wealth. In contrast, black Americans altogether own less than 2.6% of the national wealth, with most of this small sliver being in the hands of black baby boomer retirees. Black working age families are largely invisible nationally in terms of wealth. To give a clearer lens, the bottom 50% of American households control only 1% of the national wealth. And of the total 14 million black households, likely over 10 million black families fall into this bottom group that owns nearly no wealth. The racial wealth gap is real, and it's growing. While 10%, or about 8 million white homes, are worth $1.4 million or more, according to Slate.com, when you deduct the family car, 50% of African American homes, or over 7 million black families, are worth no more than $1,700. Subscribe to learn more at tonetalks.org.